Las Vegas, Nevada, the world's epicenter of entertainment, famous for wealth, lady luck, and second chances.
People come to Las Vegas to start anew. They come for the jobs, for a better future.
But beyond the city limits, Sin City reveals a darker side.
It's a great place for killing people and dumping their bodies.
A thrilling investigation that pulls detectives into a dangerous world of high-stakes deception.
It was worth several $1 million, and a number of people were in line to inherit that money.
It was extremely suspicious.
Where nothing is as it seems.
You realize, oh my word, this whole thing is a tapestry of lies.
And in the right place at the right time, investigators quickly learn that anyone is capable of anything.
Behind that veneer of niceties, there's a cold-hearted killer who will kill you in a heartbeat.
Lake Mojave, Nevada, January 23rd, 1995. The Las Vegas Metropolitan Crimes Unit responds to an urgent call.
A group of fishermen were on the shores of Lake Mojave, and they were walking back to their vehicle. It was just before dawn. When they got near the parking lot, one of the flashlights had illuminated a human skull.
Las Vegas homicide detective Phil Ramos and his partner Jim Vaccaro lead up the investigation.
When we found the skull, we examined it at the scene.
Ramos notices burn marks at the base of the skull. On closer examination, he spots something equally disturbing.
We found bullet holes in the skull that clearly showed that the victim had died of multiple gunshot wounds.
The damage to the skull clearly suggests foul play. But where did it come from? And more importantly to Ramos and Vaccaro, where is the rest of the body?
This way.
They notice a series of markings on the rocks leading up a hill and follow the trail deeper into the desert.
We came across a fire pit, and you could clearly see the remains of a fire, a very substantial fire. And within the ashes and the debris of this fire, we saw small finger bones, small leg bones. There was very little left.
Recovered bone fragments are sent to the lab for analysis. But the bones are not the only puzzling clue to come out of the fire pit.
There was some nails in there and the outline and the framework of a steamer trunk.
Because the remains are so badly charred, the forensic pathologist is unable to determine the victim's age and sex. Desperate, he sends bone samples from the skull to the lab for DNA analysis. Ramos knows that recovering any usable DNA is a long shot.
At the time that this happened, DNA was in its infancy stages. So we were counting on the dental records.
You can start looking at wear of teeth, calcification of the pulp canal or the nerve canal of the tooth. You can also look at the type of dentistry being done. We take x-rays post-mortem, and we are then able to see that pattern and match it to the pattern ante-mortem.
But without existing dental records, he's unable to identify the victim. Investigators then turn to the metal fragments found at the crime scene. And piece by piece, forensic analyst Cherie Norman begins to rebuild the trunk.
We could see the dimensions of it, and the framework was there, and the metal straps were there.
Norman soon realizes that this is no ordinary trunk.
We had an antique dealer look at the remains of this trunk, and they said, yeah, they looked at the nails, and they looked at the metal, and they looked at the pattern, and they said, this is a very old trunk. It's probably 70, 80 years old. It was described as an antique humpback trunk that we learned are pretty hard to find.
Was the trunk used to transport the victim? If so, then investigators have one important question.
How did the head survive this very intense fire when everything else was just burnt down to a crisp?
Ramos gets his answer when the forensic pathologist makes a gruesome discovery.
He looked at the base of the skull where it had become separated, and he said, it looks to me like there were cut marks on one of the vertebrae. The head was decapitated from the rest of the body.
Bearing that in mind, investigators begin to reconstruct details surrounding the crime.
The body obviously was stuffed into the trunk, and the head clearly was in there as well.
The body was then dragged to the Nevada hillside, where the trunk was set on fire.
The framework of the trunk exploded because of the fire, and the skull somehow rolled away from the main fire and only suffered that small amount of thermal damage.
Minimal damage to the skull provides a valuable piece of evidence.
Well, there we are, gentlemen. Number 3.
We were able to get a firearms examiner to look at these bullet fragments.
Marks on the bullet fragments are characteristic of a .22 caliber weapon, but it's a set of tiny grooves that catches the examiner's attention.
He saw these unique rifling marks that are placed on the bullet when it passes through a silencer.
In the case of a sound suppressor, now I like the term suppressor better than silencer because unlike the movies, these things don't really silence a gun, but they do reduce the sound by a fixed level. Certainly some of the older silenced pistols, there were holes that were drilled in the barrel to control the velocity of the bullet, to keep it below the speed of sound. Those leave some fairly characteristic scrapes on the side of the bullet. Once they find what they suspect was the weapon that was used, then they can shoot that, trap the bullet, then compare the bullet with their comparative microscopes.
But so far, there's no sign of that weapon.
They had no murder weapon. They found the skull. There were holes in the skull. Looks like he was shot, but where's the gun?
All they know for sure is that someone was shot, execution style, and dumped in the desert.
Was this a mob hit? Police did look into the possible mob connection here.
That suspicion is confirmed when investigators find an abandoned Cadillac in town.
It was found in the parking lot of the Topless Club. This particular club had very close ties with known organized crime figures. In fact, it was owned by the mob.
Investigators examine the car.
I was hoping for some major piece of evidence in that car, especially maybe in the trunk or in the back seat.
The detective's instincts pay off. In the trunk of the Cadillac, he discovers a loaded semi-automatic 12-gauge shotgun. But who did it belong to? Ramos immediately runs the license plate number and learns that the car belongs to a high-profile Las Vegas businessman.
I recognize that.
Yeah.
Ron Rudin was a real estate man. He was very, very successful, made millions of dollars buying and selling residential real estate.
Ron had a bit of a reputation around town. There was two aspects to Ron. He was a very well-respected real estate developer and known to be very keen and aware of business opportunities. He was also known to be somewhat of a player.
Was Ron Rudin somehow involved in the Lake Mojave murder?
There was always some questions about his real estate deals, whether they were on the up and up.
When investigators contact his office, they are alarmed to hear that the successful businessman hasn't been seen in 3 days.
My first reaction was, oh, there's something wrong here.
Ron was a creature of habit, so when he didn't show up at work, his coworkers were immediately concerned.
Ramos and Vaccaro fear the worst when they learn that Ron Rudin's wife recently reported him missing.
The dental records of Mr. Rudin had already been supplied to the department as part of the missing persons investigation. So the forensic examiner had the dental x-rays and he compared them to the teeth that were in the skull, and he was able to make a positive identification in a matter of minutes. It only took 10-15 minutes for them to say that's Ron Rudin's skull.
Investigators finally have a victim.
Once those remains were identified, there was a full-on murder case.
But who would want to kill Ron Rudin? And why?
His car was found in a parking lot behind a strip club. Immediately raised suspicions that maybe the mob was involved, maybe something about the strip club was involved. What was it doing there?
Detectives quickly learned that Ron Rudin was a man of many secrets.
Everyone knew he made a lot of money. What did he do, and what deals did he have in the works, and who are these partners he's involved in?
In his drive for ultimate power, did Ron Rudin, the big-shot Vegas mogul, make a deal with the devil? And did the devil finally come calling? Deep in the desert hills of Nevada, police uncover the charred remains of real estate mogul Ron Rudin. Soon after, homicide detectives Phil Ramos and Jim Vaccaro also find his car, abandoned behind a Las Vegas strip club.
This particular club, as many clubs in town, topless clubs, did have ties to organized crime.
To add to their mystery, investigators find a loaded shotgun in the trunk of the car.
Ron was known to do some business transactions that were barely legal.
Was Ron Rudin's murder the result of one of those dirty deals gone bad? Investigators approach Rudin's former clients and dip into his financial records, hoping to flush out any secret business associates.
There was always something a little hinky about what he did. He wasn't always paying all the taxes he should have been paying, and he would go into sort of distressed areas and houses that weren't in very good shape, or condos that needed fixing up. He'd fix them up, and he'd flip them.
Sellers would find themselves in a desperate situation and would have no choice but to accept his lowball offer, and a lot of them weren't happy about that.
Checking up on the shotgun found in the back of the Cadillac, police learn it's registered to Rudin himself, who happened to be a licensed firearms dealer,
which enabled him to possess a number of weapons, including fully automatic weapons, weapons with silencers, and the sort of weapons that only a gun dealer, a licensed gun dealer, would be allowed to possess.
Unable to tie Rudin directly to any illegal activities in town, detectives decide to change their focus.
Who stood in line to gain the most from Ron's disappearance?
But before they move any deeper into the investigation, they have to tend to a particularly unsavory piece of business, informing Rudin's wife that she is now a widow.
I said, "Margaret, can we come out and talk to you?" And she said, "Oh my goodness, something's happened, hasn't it?" And we told her just exactly what was happening, that, you know, the missing persons case had been turned over to homicide, that we were homicide detectives, and we were anticipating that Ron had met with foul play.
Margaret tells detectives that the last time she saw her husband alive was the night before she was scheduled to open her new business.
She was getting ready for the grand opening, and he wanted to take her to the movies, and she was too busy to do that. So he told her that he was going to go to the movies or going to go do something by himself, and she said that was the last time she saw him.
That night, when Ron didn't come home, Margaret was hardly surprised. She tells police that Ron would often take off without warning, especially around the anniversary of his former wife's death. Several years ago, around Christmas time, Peggy Rudin took her own life.
She put a high-powered handgun, a .357 Magnum, up to her head and pulled the trigger.
Oh my God. No.
It was a horrible end to her life, and it left Ron devastated.
Margaret explained to us that that's why he disappeared, was because he was having, you know, a bit of a depression over the suicide of his former wife. You know, the memories were just still there.
Eventually, when Ron failed to return days later, Margaret finally contacted police. She reveals that in the days and weeks leading up to his murder, her husband was extremely paranoid.
He installed a very elaborate alarm system in the home, and it was a fortress.
Ron's obsession with security went beyond video cameras and motion detectors.
He had converted his closet into a very elaborate gun safe.
It was heavily protected and fortified with a state-of-the-art alarm system.
There were hundreds and hundreds of handguns and long rifles in his home, which was part of his leftover business when he was a firearms dealer.
There were these guard dogs that roamed around the outside. It was his private Ron Rudin arsenal.
According to Margaret, her husband never left the house without a gun.
And he would have one on his ankle or in his waist, and then he'd have one in the trunk of his car, and he was always worried that someone would come after him for his money, that someone was out to get him or out to rob him.
Fearing for his life, Ron Rudin was protecting himself from someone. But who? Investigators returned to the parking lot where Ron's Cadillac was discovered.
He was not the type to go to topless clubs, although his car was found in the parking lot of a gentleman's club. And we spoke to the manager and to some of the dancers and showed his picture, and nobody was able to say that he was in the club that night.
So why was Rudin's car left abandoned in the club's parking lot?
And the police had a very, very sophisticated knowledge of how organized crime played into Las Vegas at the time of Ron's disappearance, and they pretty quickly knew that the mob had nothing to do with this.
Another lead we had was that he had been seen at a seedy little motel near downtown Las Vegas where they show adult movies, and you go and rent rooms for 2 or 3 hours at a time. And people were certain that they saw him check into one of these rooms with what they described as a hooker. We spent about 4 days tracking down that lead, and it turned out to be completely false.
No further ahead, investigators turned their attention to Rudin's fortunes.
Ron was worth anywhere between $5, $10, $15 million.
A reading of Rudin's will reveals that company trustees Sharon Cooper and Harold Bascuti stand to inherit a whopping 40% of his estate.
The trustees were loosely associated with his business. One was a mortgage broker, the other one had a finance company, so he did business with them. These are the kind of people that he had as his friends, and they became his close friends and advisors. So he was going to compensate them for their dedication and their work to him over the years by giving them some of his money when he departed.
Poised to earn millions from Rudin's death and complete control of his real estate empire, have police finally found the motive for murder? Las Vegas real estate businessman Ron Rudin has been brutally murdered. His charred remains dumped in the hills of Nevada. Digging into Rudin's financial affairs, investigators discover that his company trustees are in line to inherit millions from his death.
It was last night.
The trustees look even more suspect when investigators discover they've been captured on a security camera in Rudin's downtown office in the middle of the night.
It was extremely suspicious.
Margaret tells police that her husband kept thousands of dollars in his office, and only she and the trustees knew about it.
They were aware that Ron kept a lot of cash in a safe that he had in the office, so they went to that safe, took the money from there. She said that the trustees stole money from him and they were keeping it for themselves.
Ron Rudin's company trustees, Bascuti and Cooper, quickly moved to the top of the suspect list.
So we had to speak to them at length.
Investigators tracked down Harold Bascuti at his private club. He immediately denies allegations of robbery and foul play.
They told us, yeah, we took money out of there and placed it into an account so that it couldn't be used.
Unsatisfied with his answers, investigators bring Bascuti to the station for further questioning.
When Ron went missing, the trustees very quickly froze his assets, took petty cash out of his office.
But something doesn't quite fit for Detective Ramos. Why didn't Bascuti and Cooper wait for regular business hours to take care of Ron's transactions? Did the trustees have a hidden agenda? Cooper claims the $20,000 they took from Ron's safe was to finance the company payroll. Investigators aren't convinced.
The night of January 18th.
Can you tell me
I was away on business in San
your
Francisco.
whereabouts on that day?
Well, from the 17th to the 22nd, I was in San Francisco on business.
I was.
Okay.
The trustees have an airtight alibi. Plane tickets and hotel receipts confirm they were both in San Francisco on business. As Bascuti and Cooper move down the suspect list, a new witness steps forward. A woman claiming to have seen Ron the day he died.
How do you know Ron?
She was a realtor, and I think Ron had done some real estate transactions with her.
Sue Lyles is heartbroken at the news of Ron's death.
We learned that Ron was having an affair with a woman, Miss Lyles. Miss Lyles, his mistress, so to speak, didn't stand to gain a thing from Ron's death. She wasn't named in the will. She wasn't given any lavish gifts. She just didn't stand to gain anything.
In fact, Sue Lyles is married with children and has everything to lose by coming forward. She presents Ramos with an anonymous letter threatening to expose her affair with Ron Rudin.
They were trying to find out, who would have known these details and how they came to know these details. If it wasn't Ron and if it wasn't Miss Lyles, who in the world else would know about these, sexual details of this affair?
Investigators can only think of one person who might want to sabotage Rudin's secret liaison, his wife.
You know Sue Lyles?
Margaret isn't surprised to learn of her husband's latest indiscretion.
Ron could not be faithful to his wife. He was having affairs with at least one woman and probably more.
Under pressure, Margaret admits to writing the letter, a desperate last-ditch effort to save her marriage.
It had to have been very difficult for Margaret. She knew that Ron was having an affair. And worse, she knew that this lady was not after Ron's money. She knew that it was an emotional attachment, which made it all the more hurtful.
Grandma, are you coming?
Yes, sweetie, I'll be right out, okay?
Okay.
Investigators decide to keep a closer eye on the bereaved widow and place her under surveillance. They soon learn that her life is wholly dedicated to running her own antique store and spending time with family. That is, until one afternoon, when she strays from routine and drives to a townhouse in downtown Las Vegas. Where moments later, a young man comes to join her in a secret liaison of her own. It appears the widow, Margaret Rudin, has found a handsome way to heal her broken heart. Investigating the murder of Las Vegas businessman Ron Rudin, police discover that his widow is having an illicit affair with a mysterious stranger.
We learned that Margaret was carrying on with a man named Yehuda Sharon, an Israeli national, who, he was a character himself.
Records show that Sharon was born in Israel, served in the Israeli intelligence service, and recently became an American citizen.
He always had these sort of fuzzy job descriptions: finance consultant, computer consultant, even though he had no qualifications. His main talent was making older, richer women feel good about themselves. Sharon is what police called a gigolo. And he would become friendly with these older, lonely women and implicate himself in their lives and their finances.
Detectives learn that the townhouse Margaret and Sharon were using for their affair is owned by Donna Cantrell, Margaret's younger sister.
Margaret and her sister Donna Cantrell had a very complicated sister-sister relationship, and they would be close, extremely close, and then they would go years in which they wouldn't talk to each other.
I'm Detective Ramos. This is Detective Vaccaro with the LVPD.
Questioning Cantrell, they discover that Margaret and Sharon have been secretly meeting for quite some time.
The friendship/affair with Yehuda Sharon was probably going on for 6 months before Ron was killed.
Why didn't Margaret tell police about the affair? They bring her in for further questioning, and this time she lays out her marriage like an open book.
From day one, it was not a peaceful marriage. It would be very, very happy, and it would be very, very miserable.
But Margaret insists that Ron was the love of her life.
Ron and Margaret met in church, and Margaret had eyes for Ron. He was good-looking. He had these cowboy boots, this kind of Western, rugged, adventuresome image.
The handsome couple was soon wed, a fifth marriage for Margaret, a sixth for Ron. But life with her new husband was hardly what Margaret had hoped for.
Ron wanted her just to be a wife and sit at home and do nothing all day. And it drove Margaret bananas. And she wanted to be out and doing things and meeting people and spending some of the Ron Rudin millions.
Margaret tells police she learned to put up with her turbulent marriage, finding solace instead in the things she loved: her grandchildren, her antique store, and Yehuda Sharon.
Margaret's idea was that Ron Rudin would drop dead of a heart attack.
But when he didn't drop dead, did Margaret take the matter into her own hands? Was she even physically capable of killing her husband?
Ron weighed over 200 pounds. He was more than 6 feet tall. If his body was stuffed in this trunk, there is no way that Margaret Rudin, this little lady, could have dragged the trunk across the rocks and the soil at Lake Mojave.
If Margaret didn't kill Rudin, then who did? Investigators bring in Yehuda Sharon for questioning.
Everything was there. Passions were strong, and there was this undercurrent of money.
My girlfriend move.
Yehuda tells police he had nothing to do with Rudin's murder.
He had what he called a Loctite alibi for the night of Ron's disappearance, the night that we believe he was murdered. You know, he freely told us, yeah, I was sleeping with so-and-so. You know, so you can check that out. And yeah, we called this woman and said, do you remember, you know, dating Yehuda on this specific night? She goes, yeah, he spent the night here.
But something about Sharon's story doesn't add up.
We were able to find from rental car receipts and records that Yehuda had rented a car on the night of Ron's disappearance.
The receipt confirms that Sharon returned the van later that same night.
The mileage on the van was within 1 or 2 miles of the distance from the rental office to Margaret's house to where the body was found and back to the house.
Is the date of the van rental and the mileage merely a coincidence?
Yehuda was in the business of selling holy oil from Israel to the Catholic Church. In fact, when we interviewed him, he said that he would travel to California to pick up the oil and bring it back, and he would bottle it himself, and then he would sell it to the church.
With no concrete evidence to tie Sharon to the crime, investigators returned to the drawing board. A jealous widow, scheming company trustees, and his wife's ambitious secret lover all stand to profit from Rudin's death.
The motives in this killing are as old as murder: passion and greed.
But which one pulled the trigger?
He got pretty intense. I mean, it was clear that there was either, you know, a motive of revenge or money that was linked to his murder.
The suspect list narrows when the trustees ask to meet with investigators. To clear their names, they offer to close Rudin's business, cutting off any chance at profiting from his death.
We eliminated the trustees because of the level of cooperation we had gotten from them. So they were telling us about a directive that was in Ron's will, that if he died under suspicious circumstances, that he wanted anybody that was eligible for his money to be thoroughly investigated. And the trustees were convinced 100% that Margaret was behind Ron's murder, so they, in essence, locked her out of Ron's estate and Ron's trust.
But investigators have no hard evidence tying Margaret Rudin to her husband's death, until a mysterious package found at the bottom of nearby Lake Mead blows the case wide open. After spending months investigating the murder of Ron Rudin, police narrow in on one suspect, his wife. But they have no concrete evidence to link her to the crime, until a man diving in nearby Lake Mead makes an unlikely discovery.
He sees this bundle, picks it up, who knows, could be anything, brings it up, opens it up, and it is a gun with a silencer.
The diver notifies police and the weapon is sent to firearms examiner Torrey Johnson for analysis.
Torrey Johnson examined it and said, wow, this is, you know, crazy. You don't very often see abandoned guns with a silencer on them.
Johnson takes the gun apart looking for clues.
The gun itself was examined for fingerprints, but it had been submerged in water for some time, so it had gotten rust on it, so there were no fingerprints on the gun at all.
Turning his attention to the bullets, Johnson test fires the gun.
He said, holy smokes, I don't believe this.
They shoot the bullet through the gun, perfect match.
The bullets that came out of Ron's skull came from a gun that we have in evidence.
Investigators finally have their murder weapon.
You know, probably one of the biggest breaks we had in this case was the finding of the gun that was used in Ron's murder.
But who does the gun belong to? Johnson enters the serial number into the National Firearms Database.
He called me up and he says, you're not going to believe what I found.
The gun belongs to Ron Rudin himself.
And that's when we did a background check on the gun and found that it was stolen or that it had disappeared.
It turned out to be an amazing development in this case, that he was shot with his own gun.
Detectives learned that Rudin reported the gun missing years earlier. Knowing that their victim kept his weapons under strict lock and key, police zero in on the only person who had access to his guarded collection. And again, all roads lead back to his beautiful widow.
And we started focusing directly on Margaret.
Investigators search her antique store.
I was doing the search warrant at the business and found a receipt for a humpback trunk, the exact kind of trunk that we had found at the crime scene where Ron's body was disposed of.
Discovering the receipt prompts investigators to search Ron's office, hoping to find evidence that will more strongly link Margaret to the murder. Scanning through hours of Rudin's surveillance footage, they discover that his wife was spying on his every move.
It was the office manager who actually had found some listening devices that Margaret had planted in his office.
But Margaret's obsessive nature isn't enough to charge her with murder. Police still need something concrete tying her to the crime.
Yes, can I help you?
We have a search warrant.
Ramos and Vaccaro return to the Rudin home looking for signs of foul play. While the forensic team combs each and every room, they discover that Margaret has converted the master bedroom into a home office.
Why that was done, we don't know.
Was Margaret covering something up?
They made an eerie discovery. They found something else in that bedroom.
Forensic experts discover traces of blood on the ceiling. The samples are rushed to the lab for DNA analysis. But the blood doesn't belong to Ron Rudin.
And that was brain matter from Ron's previous wife, Peggy, who killed herself there. And it was one of the very eerie and very, very disconcerting discoveries during this case.
The discovery once again lets Margaret off the hook. When pressed about the renovations to the bedroom, she claims she's just getting on with her life and making necessary changes.
She wouldn't cooperate with us and she wouldn't talk to us. You know, everything was pointing towards her.
The case stalls once again until a young man comes forward with new information.
I think his mother kind of convinced him to finally talk to police.
We were contacted by a young man named Augustine Lovato, and he was a day laborer who had been hired by Margaret to clean up the bedroom in the house. He was charged with taking that bed apart, stashing it, and pulling the carpet up. And while he was doing all this, he noted that on the carpet there was a really dark, smelly, gelatinous fluid underneath the carpet, and it smelled really bad to him. And he thought, boy, that's weird. That almost looks like blood. And he said to us, it just gave me the creeps.
Margaret had Lovato repaint the walls, replace the carpet, and dispose of the bed.
The bed and the mattress and the frame were taken to a dumpster.
Well, he wasn't 100% sure what had gone on. I mean, he's just some guy who's being hired to clean up this house. He knows that it's creepy and something weird went on there.
Led by Lovato, investigators head to the dumpster, hoping to find Margaret's bedroom furniture and any DNA evidence.
And we went and looked for the mattress and the frame that he had described.
But the dumpster has been recently emptied. Desperate to find the mattress and bed frame, Vaccaro and Ramos sweep the area.
Is this the mattress?
Yeah, that's it.
And we found him. There was blood stains on there, and that confirmed every bit of his story.
The handyman's information was critical. It proved, if it was a murder, where it occurred in the house and really propelled the investigation forward.
At the forensic lab, luminol tests confirm that the stain on the mattress is indeed blood. But the problem is matching it to Rudin. His remains are much too charred to yield any useful DNA. To prove that the blood on the mattress belongs to Ron Rudin, Ramos and Vaccaro return to his home, hoping that traces of his DNA survived Margaret's recent renovations.
Carl, got something? Yeah.
And we found a handkerchief on Ron's side of the bathroom that had Dad's blood on it. And we thought, well, this is going to be a way to get some DNA.
DNA experts compare the blood on the mattress to the DNA on the handkerchief. Both belong to Ron Rudin. The match proves that Ron was shot inside his home and in his own bed. Margaret Rudin lied to police. She renovated the bedroom to cover up a murder scene and hired Augustine Lovato to dispose of any incriminating evidence. With subpoena in hand, Ramos and Vaccaro move in to make the arrest.
We went to where she was staying and Margaret was gone.
A fugitive wanted for murder. Margaret's disappearance spawns a national manhunt.
Let's go.
And suddenly, Ron Rudin's broken-hearted widow, his beautiful high society wife, and his cold-blooded killer is now on the run. Ron Rudin, a Las Vegas businessman, has been brutally murdered, his body dismembered, burned, and dumped in the Nevada desert. His wife, Margaret, is charged with first-degree murder.
There was an emotional motive here to kill her husband.
But when police move in to arrest Margaret, she has suddenly vanished.
We put her into a national database to locate her, and then we just started trying to find out where she was, you know, using all the resources available to us to track her down, and she did a pretty good job of running from the law.
Desperate to locate the fugitive, investigators turned to the media for help.
While Margaret was on the run, she was featured on America's Most Wanted many, many, many times.
By the time there was enough evidence to charge Margaret Rudin with the murder, she was gone. America's Most Wanted soon joined the hunt.
I think the media exposure was a big help for us because Margaret knew we were hot on her trail.
The national exposure pays off when Phoenix police receive an anonymous phone call.
We got information that someone had seen someone that matched the description on America's Most Wanted.
Acting on the tip, Phoenix officer Christopher Mendez is dispatched to a flower shop where Margaret Rudin was spotted. But when he arrives, there's no sign of her anywhere. He questions the florist.
Good morning. Can I help you?
When I spoke with her, she was sweet as pie. She was very nice.
Certainly.
She identified herself as, I believe it was Ann Boatwright, and gave us an ID. In fact, she even produced a social security number.
Thank you.
Anything else I can do?
It seems the anonymous tip is nothing more than a dead end.
I'd like to give you one of these.
No, you know what? That's okay.
No, really. No, really. I think it would look awesome on you.
But something doesn't sit right with Mendez.
The way she carried herself, how she walked, she looked like a lady of power.
He runs Ann Boatwright's name through the police database.
At the time, we didn't have anything on our computer systems that said that Ann Boatwright was wanted or that Ann Boatwright had her identity stolen.
But Mendez can't get around Boatwright's striking resemblance to Margaret.
Where's that lady I was just speaking with?
Annette, she's gone out back.
The Phoenix police officer is too late. Desperate to locate their fugitive, investigators launch a citywide search. But somehow, once again, she manages to slip under the police radar.
I believe what made Margaret Rudin so dangerous is that she's likable.
Margaret developed into a social chameleon. She was charming, and so she could just blend in. She would stay on the run forever if she could have.
Margaret was gone for about almost 2 years. She had a pretty sophisticated network of friends that were helping her avoid capture.
Cut off from her husband's estate, police know that Margaret is short on cash and hunting for new targets.
Margaret was a very charming lady, and if she really wanted to lay on the charm, she would bring on her Southern Belle accent, and it worked, especially on men.
Investigators ramp up national media attention, splashing Margaret's face across America.
Again, there was an airing on America's Most Wanted, and some people in the Boston area recognized her. The cops set up a surveillance on the apartment where Margaret was living.
Undercover officers quickly learn that Margaret is up to her old tricks, already with a new and promising companion.
She was able to charm this fireman and began living with him.
While they're watching, they see a pizza delivery guy show up.
With Margaret finally within their grasp, police make their move.
You know, the cops, God bless them, this was a great piece of police work. They said, that's our way into the apartment. And her roommate opened the door, and they came in and heard Margaret running into the bathroom. So the cops crashed the apartment and found her hiding in the bathroom, and she was trying to cover up her face, and they opened up the door, and they said, "Margaret?" And she says, "Yes." And they said, "You know what this is about?" And she goes, "Yeah, it's about that Vegas thing." And, you know, game over. They called us, said, "We got your girl here." And, you know, I'll be honest, Jimmy and I high-fived and jumped on a plane and went out to Boston to get all the evidence that we could.
Charged with murder, Margaret's story captures the attention of the American public. As prosecutors present their case to a grand jury, the compounding evidence is undeniable. Margaret Rudin is the only person who had access to steal the murder weapon. She owned a receipt for the purchase of a Camelback trunk found cremated with Ron Rudin's remains. And most damaging, she lied to police to cover up a murder scene in her home and hired a handyman to dispose of the bloody evidence. Proof positive that Ron Rudin was shot to death in his own bed. Convinced beyond a doubt, the jury finds Margaret Rudin guilty of first-degree murder.
Prosecutors believe that Ron Rudin was shot in his sleep, that his wife put a .22 caliber pistol with a silencer and fired multiple times.
In May 2001, Margaret Rudin is sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole. But one question remains unanswered.
The lingering question is, did Margaret have help? In life, Ron weighed over 200 pounds. He was more than 6 feet tall. If his body was stuffed in this trunk, there is no way that Margaret Rudin, this little lady, could have dragged the trunk across the rocks and the soil at Lake Mojave.
Investigators have no physical evidence to prove she had an accomplice.
Although they had suspicions, never arrested or charged anybody else. In this case,
on January 19th, 2009, after a decade in prison and 2 attempts at appealing her sentence, Margaret Rudin is granted a new trial on the basis of incompetent defense. At present, the prosecution is appealing her request.
Margaret had this odd view of herself, and she would write about it in her journal. It was like she was watching herself performing in what she called the play that is my life. Then reality finally set in. It finally hit her that she has been convicted of murder.